Welcome to The Real News. I'm Mark Steiner. It's good to have you all with us today. As many of you know, on August the 4th, 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate blew up in the port of Beirut. At least 170 people were killed, thousands injured, and it leveled a huge portion of the city. It was actually one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. Corruption and incompetence, many people say, causes the explosion. Ammonium nitrate is highly explosive. Officials knew it was dangerous, but let it sit there on the port for almost 7 years. In its wake, massive demonstrations took place demanding that the government step down, which it has. But what does that really mean? And the fragile peace that was created 30 years ago after the Lebanese Civil War led to what many people consider a really ineffectual government and working of a government. And this disaster has exposed it. Some think it's the beginning of the unraveling of Lebanon. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. That's what we'll discuss in part. International forces from Israel to the United States to Iran to France are all complicit in the destruction and problems that take place in Lebanon. And so what would become of Beirut? I mean, once people called it was the Paris of the Mediterranean, or as the great Gibran, the great Lebanese poet wrote once, he said, "My Lebanon is a serene mountain sitting between the sea and the plains, like a poet, one eternity and another." So to take a look at what happened and what this means for us all, we have our two guests who joined us today, looking at Lebanon, the Middle East, and more. Joining us from Beirut is George Azar. George has covered the Middle East as a photojournalist and documentary filmmaker for decades. He's the author of two books, Palestine, A Photographic Journey, and Palestine, a Guide. He did with Mariam Shaheen. His documentary films have been on numerous networks, and his photographs have appeared on the front pages of the New York Times, the London Times, and many other journals internationally. He's covered the Lebanese Civil War, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the Iran-Iraq War, the first Palestinian Intifada, American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as in Gaza. And he's now the photojournalist in residence at the American University in Beirut. And George, good to see you again. Welcome to The Real News for the first time.
Thank you.
And we're once again joined by James Zogby, co-founder of the Arab American Institute. In 1985, continues as their president. He's director of Zogby Research Services that conducts groundbreaking surveys across the Middle East. Obama appointed Dr. Zogby to the UN's Commission on International Religious Freedom, and his weekly column is published in 12 countries. In 2010, he published this really interesting book that I actually interviewed him about called Arab Voices. And 2013, looking at Iran, the rise and fall of Iran and Arab public opinion, all this drawn from his experience polling across the Middle East with Zogby Research. And he's been a progressive leader in the Democratic Party, serving on the DNC, and a senior advisor to Jesse Jackson, and much more. And James Zogby, welcome back to The Real News. Good to have you with us as well.
Thank you, Mark.
So let's start, George, just with you, because you're in Beirut, at the heart of where this happened. And I know you were injured slightly in this explosion when glass came flying into your apartment. So talk just a bit about what's happening in Lebanon from your perspective and what happened that day.
Well, that day, I was in my apartment. It was, getting towards evening, 6 p.m. I live actually quite far from the port. I would say it's maybe 2 kilometers as the crows fly. And I stepped away from my desk and felt an earthquake. And I've lived for a long time in California, so I know earthquakes. And I thought, that is a really, really big earthquake. I mean, the building was shaking. And I turned to my partner and I looked at her and she looked at me and we said, what was that? And then all of a sudden, boom, the windows blew in. I was blown off my feet onto the floor. Practically every sliding glass window pane that we had blew into the apartment. Luckily, the curtains acted like a parachute and caught most of the flying glass. It was so heavy, after I dusted myself off the floor, when I picked it up, it weighed 10 kilos. I ran to the balcony and I looked out. My view is over the city and I saw a mushroom cloud like Hiroshima, but it was blood red. And I couldn't imagine what it might be. I thought an explosion of that size must have been the entire parliament that went up. But no, it was the port. I had no idea. At the time I was lying on the ground, I thought an artillery shell has hit the building. It's probably hit, the next room. That's how powerful it was. In all my experience, I've never seen an explosion like that. Never, ever, ever. Nothing close. not the destruction of the Marine barracks in 1983, not in the Israeli invasion in 82, not in the many ground wars that I covered in Afghanistan or Iraq or in Gaza. Nothing like that. Off the charts.
I think it's really important for us to hear that, and for people to hear like what it means to be in the midst of that. And let's go to the politics of what's happening here. And I'll go to Jim first and come right back to George. I mean, in the wake of this, Jim, there were these massive demonstrations taking place all throughout Beirut. And eventually Prime Minister Hassan Diab resigned, his government resigned. But politically, what do you think that really means?
Well, it could mean absolutely nothing, because we've seen this kind of upheaval before. And there was a quote 2 days ago in the New York Times that struck me at the very end of an article, and it said, it was one of the protesters, he said, "We can't continue unless we put our hands together and get rid of all the politicians, but I don't know how we're going to do it." And therein lies the dilemma. You have this massive protest movement, which is actually quite new in Lebanon. I mean, we saw it to get the Syrians out. We've seen it in other instances, but in this current era, wanting an end to the government, when they say all means all, or all of them means all of them, and they're hanging nooses and hanging government leaders by effigy. There is an enormous upheaval of the soul of the people of Lebanon. They want them all gone. But the French come in and say, we want a national unity government, which is basically taking the same old pieces and just putting them back together again. But they resign, and then we read today that they're in consultation. The parties are in consultation. Again, it's the same old, same old. So there are actually three dilemmas. There is, if you listen to the people in the streets and listen to the protest movements, they want an end to corruption, which has bankrupted the country and caused it to go into economic freefall and political paralysis, so that basically nothing has been done to address these issues. And they want a new system, but the vehicles or the avenues to pursue the new system involve the same old players. And so there's no way to get there. In other countries, the military would step in, or there'd be a sufficient enough wisdom on the part of some of the political leadership to offer some sort of compromise. I just don't see that in the offing right now. And there's three things that need to be done. One is there needs to be an impartial investigation to find out what happened. And there's no one in Lebanon that will trust the political parties or the existing government or anyone associated with that government, Hezbollah included, to figure this out. Secondly, they need massive humanitarian aid and then later on aid to rebuild. And there's no one in the country that is going to trust that money to go to the government or any agencies of the government without feeding the corruption that has bankrupted the country and meanwhile made these guys tremendously wealthy and been used as patronage to buttress their support. And then there needs to be reform. And again, the question is, who are the agents of that reform? So there's a dilemma here. And at some point, one would hope that some of the political leadership would agree not just to resign, but to actually meet with the protest leadership and call for a dramatic restructuring, not like Taif, which simply moved some of the pieces around, changed the configuration from the French structuring of government to a new structuring of government, but the kind of radical reform that people want. And in the polling that we do, we actually find that the majority of Lebanese want one man, one vote. They want a new system. They don't want sectarian governance anymore. They're fed up with almost all they feel actually they want something brand new. The question is, will they be able to structure their protest movement sufficiently enough to gain political power? And will there be someone on the side of the establishment who'll step up and say, we will meet with you and let's work out a way. We'll give this up. And you know, there needs to be that will to do it. I just don't know if that's in the offing right yet.
One of the things that, just for our viewers here, when Dr. Zaghi mentioned Taif agreement, that was the agreement that ended the Lebanese civil war that created this government that he described so well. And George, I mean, let's pick up on one of the things that Jim was talking about, which is that the protests on the ground. And who represents them? Who are they? I mean, what is the politics and the social movement that's taking place that we may not see in the Western press?
Well, first of all, the politics, you know, the makeup of the demonstrations are really drawn across sects and across classes. And on the bigger demonstrations in Beirut, you have people coming from all different parts of the country, from as far north as Azar and Tripoli, and as far south as Nabatea and the border areas. There is a tremendous desire in this country for progressive reform, independent, technocratic government, which will implement changes not only in the system of government here, but in the living conditions and the lifestyle. For example, in the last municipal elections, there was a party called Beirut Medinati, which means Beirut, my city. They were drawn largely from sort of the educated classes, from, you know, the best and the brightest across sects in Lebanon. They ran for office against the entrenched political establishment. They had never been a party before. They had no external funding. They were able to gather 40% of the vote. 40% of the vote. And the one thing that Amal and Hezbollah and the Lebanese forces and the Hariri group agreed upon was that they should band together to beat Beirut Medinati. Unfortunately, because of the structure of the municipality here, earning 40% of the vote got them no one in office. So, but it's a remarkable showing for, you know, a group that basically had no outside funding and had nothing to offer except their expertise. They said, turn over the city to us. We'll clean up the traffic. We'll fix the garbage problem. You know, we'll establish city parks and public spaces. We'll save Beirut heritage buildings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the reaction of the populace was extremely positive. And I think, you know, Jim is right. I think, you know, by and large, the Lebanese want one man, one vote. But it's these entrenched political elites that refuse to go and even throw the smallest crumb to the Thawra movement, to the revolution, to acknowledge, you know, their desires.
This some people have been writing that this is this could be the unraveling of Lebanon once again. And you know, when you realize that the vast majority of food that the Lebanese eat comes in through the port that was just blown up, that these demonstrations are taking place across the country, and especially in Beirut. And given Jim, what George was just talking about, let's talk a bit about what the political future might be. Because I mean, Lebanon's a really very critical nation in the Middle East, where it sits. You know, it involves forces from across the Middle East that get involved in the Lebanese world, from Iran to Israel and more. So I mean, you're not prescient of a crystal ball, but you do have analysis. So what do you think this is headed?
I don't know. I mean, I wish I did. It's easy to imagine a positive outcome. It's also easy to imagine a stalemate because we've been in this situation before and for a long time. You talked about the unraveling. Lebanon's been unraveling for a long time. And frankly, these guys haven't given a damn. They have secured their positions of power, and they protect their families and their tribes and their regions of the country. And that's all that matters. What's interesting is that the growing gap between them and those for whom they provide patronage, and the masses of people who have been the victims of their neglect and their corruption, they are being rejected, but they still hold the reins of power and wealth. And so, you know, it's not. I mean, what's surprising to me is that having watched all of these movements unfold, I don't think I ever saw. I mean, even when Mubarak was as hated as he was by people in the streets, they weren't hanging him in effigy and the rest of his cabinet. I mean, these guys are being hung in the streets right now. That's how angry people are. And if you talk about, I mean, Lebanon has been, because the good side, the bad side of being a complex, multi-sectarian, you know, multi-denominational, whatever country, and having the politics of the country organized around sect, is that made Lebanon, on the one hand, sort of laissez-faire and a bit more tolerant than other countries, but at the same time, it left Lebanon open to external intervention, so that during the Civil War, it never really was just a civil war. It was always Lebanon as the regional playground where everybody carried their feuds out using one Lebanese party or another. And that's still kind of where we are. I mean, people have, patrons who fund them, who fuel them. That's not unusual in the Arab world. I mean, we're seeing it play out in Yemen. We're seeing it play out in Libya. We're seeing it play out in Syria. We saw it play out in Iraq. Iran is there. The Saudis were there. The Turks are now there. The Americans are there. The Russians have their folks, and the Israelis have theirs. And so what the people are saying is that enough of this, and they want it to end. And it's interesting that when we poll, that we find an absence of sectarian identity. The number one identifier among Lebanese, it's not my sect, it's not my family, it's not my region, it's being Lebanese. And they don't want sectarian rule. And they don't support, I mean, it's interesting, in the last poll we did in November of last year, Iran, 70% of Lebanese said that they were upset with Iran's meddling in their country. That we never saw that before. Shia, Sunni, and Christians agreeing Iran was a problem, also agreeing America was a problem, Israel was a problem, etc. There are things that bring people together. They don't have, as that quote in the New York Times said, they don't have the lever to use to translate their aspirations into the power they need to get the kind of country that they want. And that's where I hope people can find a way to support that in Lebanon. I mean, if Macron had been smart, and I'm not sure he is, I mean, I think he was more delighted with the fact that he got support in the streets of Lebanon that he could never get in the streets of Paris because they were hungry for somebody to come and do something for him. But if there were an international gathering of nations that say to the Lebanese, we will support you if, rather than Macron saying, I want you to do this, I mean, France is the creator of the problem. They're not the solution to the problem. And that's how the Lebanese view it. But I believe that an all-party conference on Lebanon might be helpful. That would include Iran, which is part of the problem and therefore has to be part of the solution. I mean, I read an article the other day by somebody who I respect a great deal, but who said there's no solution unless Hezbollah is destroyed or removed from the scene. That's not going to happen. Can they be tamed? Yes. Can they be brought under a new umbrella? Can they be incorporated into the army in some way? Probably in the long term, I think, even in the short term, maybe. But it's been tried to destroy them before. There's no victor, no vanquished in Lebanon. There has to be a new formula that is achieved by consensus. And the one way to help create that consensus is the international community making it more desirable for the Lebanese, these factions, to move in the right direction and sit down with the protest movement in the streets and come up with this a new parliament that is non-sectarian, a new governance that is not based on patronage, etc. That could happen, but I'm not sure we're there yet.
So George, when you hear what Jim Zogby is saying, and you've been living there for a while now, right? You've been back a good 10
I first
years?
came here in 1981, so I've been here
a long time. And so, through the Civil War and watching this dismemberment of a country and attempting to come back in a very kind of not a really very powerful way after the Taif Agreement. So, what about what Jim was saying? I mean, I'd like to see what your analysis of what you see on the ground. Are we witnessing now an event like the pandemic which is also ravaging Lebanon? Are we seeing the unraveling of Lebanon here? I mean, where do you think this goes?
Yeah, I fully agree with Jim. This problem is bigger than Lebanon. It's beyond the ability of the Lebanese to solve this problem. It requires an international solution, and it requires bringing the regional players all to the table, including Iran. This is much bigger than Lebanon. This is much bigger, and it won't be solved by these criminals in power.
So let me just make one point too, that having, I didn't live there through the Civil War, George, but I visited many, many times during that period. It broke my heart every time I'd go to see what the Lebanese were doing to themselves, right? And what always troubled me was this notion of Lebanese resilience, because it was the very fact that the shells would fly and then they'd stop and everybody would go out in the street and just continue life as normal, right? Going past shelled out buildings to get the day provisions. And so what was interesting was that what's happened since October last is that for the first time, the Lebanese resilience gave way to Lebanese anger and despair. And you had, as you noted, a cross-denominational, multi-sectarian protest movement that said enough's enough, end it. This is the first time you've seen that in Lebanon. They usually just say, well, it's okay, we'll go on, and we'll just keep going. They're not ready to do it anymore. They've reached the breaking point. Who's going to respond to them reaching the breaking point? And can they mobilize that sufficiently enough to have the political power necessary to make someone from the elite, the establishment side, sit down with them and say, okay, here's what we're going to give up. Here's what we're going to do to work with you to make this happen. That's what has to happen. I mean, the problem in Egypt was that the mass protest movement never became a political party, never became a political organization. I mean, Ann Patterson, the US ambassador, got beaten up for saying, stop protesting, form a party and win an election. These guys got to do it. And I think you're right. I mean, but what Beirut Medinati did was actually show it could be done. What Paula Yacoubian did was show it could be done. I mean, you could have an independent actually winning a decisive vote, or at least getting a huge majority, a huge plurality. That can happen. It's got to scare the pants off these people, but it can't happen within the structure of you win that many votes, but because of the sectarian breakout, you don't get any seats. You're not entitled to them. So, but they can continue to scare them, and if they do it sufficiently enough, with enough weight, I think you can maybe bring something to bear. What would help ease that, the midwife of this, could be the international community. They've got to be willing to play that role, and certainly Trump's not going to do it. I don't know if the French have that kind of vision, or they just see a short-term game here. I don't know.
So George, why don't you pick up from that point and give us your closing thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the thing that troubles me is the protest movement here was massive and sustained and inspiring and nonviolent. And the ruling elites did nothing. And I'm afraid that it might require violence before they actually sit up and pay attention. I don't think it's in the spirit of the protest movement by and large. I mean, there are rioters out there, but by and large, the civil society movement here is an extremely peaceful one. And I hate to think that you really have to resort to serious violence to push the powers that be to change. Well,
I think that Lebanon is a really important country and important in the Middle East, and given all the countries that are involved in it. And I appreciate the work you both have done and joining us here today. And I look forward to another conversation to revisit this and see where this is going. And I want to thank you both for your work and your time today. I know you're both very busy, and glad you're safe, George, Azar, and you made it through the blast and you're with us. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And Jim Zogby, always a pleasure to have you with us as well. And thank you for taking your time.
Thank you.
And we will continue to look at what goes on in Lebanon with our two guests and more. And I thank you for joining us. Let us know what you think and what you'd like to learn about. I'm Mark Steiny here for the Real News Network. Take care.